All right, well, good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well, and welcome to week number 4 for Intergovernmental Relations. Welcome back. This week we are covering fiscal federalism. And as you know, last week we did the political aspects of federalism. This week we're doing fiscal federalism, and then next week we'll do the administrative aspects of federalism. So in terms of fiscal federalism for this week, your discussion board post that you'll be turning in by Sunday asks that you select one intergovernmental grant that you are familiar with or interested in, and to discuss some potential revisions and changes to that type of grant in order to try and make it more efficient and more effective. And so, again, for that beach board posting, if you select a grant, you could select a grant where you're looking at perhaps changing it so that instead of having state pass-through requirements, it's a federal grant that can go directly to local governments. That could be a potential revision that can make the grant more efficient or more effective. Perhaps changing the duties or responsibilities of different levels of government in terms of spending that money and implementing and executing that grant also could make it more efficient or more effective. So just look at whatever grant you're choosing. Make sure it's a grant that has some intergovernmental components to it. A federal grant that goes through state and local governments, or a state grant being handed down to local governments, and make sure it's got that intergovernmental component. And then just think about the grant and ways in which you would recommend changing the grant to try and make it more effective and more efficient. So that's your post for discussion board number 4, I guess it is now. And then you'll have your responses to 2 classmates as well. So earlier in the course, we talked about the different eras of federalism, and we identified this era of federalism known as fiscal federalism. We also called it cooperative federalism. And we said in fiscal or cooperative federalism, it's after the Great Depression with the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the creation of all of these New Deal programs. Roosevelt was trying to help state and local governments recover from the Great Depression primarily through the use of federal grants and aid. And so once these federal grants and aid started flowing out of Washington, D.C., the relationship between different levels of government really started to be characterized by money. And that's really what fiscal federalism is. It's defining the relationship between the different levels of government with money. And so that's going to be our primary focus for this week. And looking at our agenda for this week, we had 5 articles that were on the agenda for this week. One of those articles we're going to have to push to next week, and that is the Moneypenny article that due to illness, Oyuki's going to do that one for us next week. So instead of 5 articles, we only have 4 articles for this evening. So we have the Economics of Intergovernmental Grants article, we have the Spraja article, we have the Wide Categorical Grants article by the USACIR, and then the Bernoulli Financing Local Governments article. I think Luis had reached out to me and asked if he could do his discussion near the end of class tonight. And so if that still holds true, I'll honor that request and we'll push the article by Luis, the Economics of Intergovernmental Grants. We'll push that to the end of our session tonight. And then again, as I said, the Moneypenny article we'll have to do at the beginning of class next week. So the way in which the agenda is looking this evening is, I think if everyone's okay with it, we'll start with the Spraja article, which is Jocelyn's article. Then we'll move into the Wide Categorical Grants article, and then the Bernoulli Financing Local Government article, and then we'll wrap everything up then with the Economics of Intergovernmental Grants article, which Luis will then lead our discussion on. So that's what we'll be doing this evening. The next week, we'll pick up the Moneypenny article, and then we have 4 other articles on the administrative aspects of federalism. So next week, we'll do Moneypenny, then we'll do the 10th Commandments article, that will be Corals. We'll do the Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations, Kamara. We'll do the Politics of Unfunded Mandates, which will be Bernie's, and then Christina will do another look at bargaining force. And those will be the articles that we will be doing then for next week. All right. So without further ado, we'll get started with the Spraja article. And so Jocelyn, that is your article. I've enabled screen sharing, so you should be able to share your slides if you have any. And I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you for a discussion of Spraja.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, so hi everyone. As you know, my name is Jocelyn, and for this discussion, I'm focusing on entrepreneurial cities, U.S. federalism, and economic development by Alberta Sprague. I believe this article is the final conclusion of her book, Debt Wish. So this conclusion takes place, it takes the entire book and summarizes her points, also providing some additional detail within the summary. So if you do want more information on her subject, she does have a full book about it. This book was published in 1996. So while this book is 26 years old, I do believe that some of her arguments are applicable to this day. So beginning with an overview, in Entrepreneurial Cities, the author focuses on how local governments have played a key role in entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs and political actors in the development and control over their own development. So meaning that cities are more than just static features of American politics and will act towards other governments in ways that other interest groups do, or in that they push their own agendas on the topics that they want to move forward. So she argues that the local governments are seen as investors and have used entrepreneurial activity and the use of circumvention to move beyond federal and state policies and build infrastructure and grow their own economy. And this is all happening while the federal government and state governments do attempt to regulate local government control, but we'll expand on those details in the next few slides. So the article begins by calling governments political actors. And she points out that in the US, there are thousands of governments, each with their own institutional self-interest at hand. And because there are thousands of governments with their own interests, local governments will defend and pursue their goals through a variety of different strategies. So this again ties into governments not being static and using strategies that benefit themselves. And by using a variety of different strategies to pursue their goals, local governments have increased their power to borrow funds and invest it, even with the limitations of state and federal governments. So this article is not about groups or individuals that try to influence decisions about which projects to fund the way traditional politics does. It's more about focusing on the strategies that governments have used as institutions to increase their power to borrow funds and invest it in however they see fit. So now I have a true or false question. Governments as political actors are governors operating with their own institutional self-interests and will pursue their goals through a variety of different strategies. Is this true or false? I don't know where to see the comments. Others. Okay. All right. So I think we have everyone in. So yes, the answer is true. Governments operate in their institutional self-interest and will pursue their goals through a variety of different strategies. And for my next question, do you agree or disagree that local governments behave in their own self-interest? And you could either unmute your mic or just answer in the chat box, whatever you're more comfortable with. Okay, so most of you agree. Interesting. All right. So then the article ties into the politics of circumvention. So The article moves to the strategies used by governments to increase their power and shares that governments use politics as circumvention. And by circumvention, she means manipulating the organizations of government itself to increase a city's desired flexibility and desired outcomes. And this was seen in the 19th and 20th century as federalism was molded through the use of circumvention. Circumvention was used through federal judge rulings, bond markets, and actions by federal and local governments. And to provide some context and history, in the 19th century, economic entrepreneurship with local governments was dominant, and there was really little federal oversight. So state and local governments took advantage of this until they were essentially stopped. And the article didn't go into detail as far as like what they did, but I assume it's federal restrictions to reduce their oversight. So local governments began to circumvent or bypass these restrictions by using financial and legal channels that would let them resume their entrepreneurial goals. So then in the 20th century, the federal government redirected this process through tax laws and tax exemptions. So this process of entrepreneurship, restriction, and circumvention has been occurring over and over again. And that's what the article argues that has shaped and molded federalism and what has shaped the way local investment occurs. And the article then moves to discuss democracy and territorial politics. So Sprague begins by stating that governments are politicians in their dealings with other governments. So much like how conventional politics uses elected officials and interest groups, governments in this instance use judges and national legislators. And judges allow, so for example, judges allow governments to circumvent other levels of government, while national legislators can force state and local borrowers to change their ways. So she stresses that intergovernmental politics should be treated as seriously as traditional politics and should also coexist with traditional politics. So in her opinion, federalism should not be viewed as a static characteristic in the American political system, but should really be seen as a political dynamic, because not doing so would diminish the complexity of what American politics is and what policymaking is. And she does recognize that the voting public is generally unaware and uninvolved in the intergovernmental politics, given that it's less democratic and it's very technical compared to traditional politics. And because they are less democratic and pretty technical, they do not really interest the general public or constituents. So she uses the example of using revenue bonds as an example that occurs throughout government, but isn't really, the public isn't really interested in it. The creation of public authorities. So these two things are not typical to traditional politics and are usually invisible topics that really lack human interest. These topics are also called bloodless compared to your standard traditional politics. And then we move over to intergovernmental politics. So the article then moves over and begins by stating that conflict between governments is not seen as political because it doesn't have the social and economic and racial group involvement influencing governments, but intergovernmental politics set the parameters of choice for traditional politics. And then the article goes into detail about what intergovernmental politics means and what are the three important features of it that create intergovernmental politics. And the first is that politics are horizontal. So this is seen as the competition that exists between federal, state, and local governments within the last 2 centuries. And then the second is that intergovernmental politics is driven by 2 different views of the American economy and economic growth. So federal governments tend to view the government and economy on a macro level, whereas local leaders view the economy really spatially and territorially. So for example, where one lives, where they operate their business and pay their taxes and hire employees really depends more to local officials, where it matters less to the federal officials. And then it is these views of varying views between the federal government and the local government that create different positions of where the economic policy should lie. And then the third is that this conflict encourages the development of strategies intended to benefit local governments, even as structural limits such as state or federal make that more difficult. Okay, and now I have a knowledge check. So the features of intergovernmental politics is it A, politics are horizontal, B, intergovernmental governmental politics is driven by two different views of the American economy and of economic growth. C, conflict encourages development of strategies intended for the discretion or benefit of local officials, or D, all of the above. And I think we have a good majority of the class. So I'm going to say yes. Yes. So thank you for listening. It's D, all of the above. Okay, so continuing with intergovernmental politics, governments are central actors in the politics of federalism, and this is because American federalism is not seen as a static feature. So governments can drive the political process by developing strategies such as tax laws, creating public-private networks, and using judicial interventions to meet their goals. And intergovernmental institutions should be thought of as politicians and policy actors in their own rights. So they're not simply there to respond to interest group pressures or serve public administrators. They're really there to be strategic and design ways that benefit themselves. So governmental politics are the very fabric of American governance and should not be seen as marginal to politics, but should really be coexisting with them. And this is because government opportunities and strengths have changed over time and are the result of 2 centuries of deeply rooted in the US history of the US economy and structure. So the structure was created by competition and conflict in position, authority, and jurisdiction, as well as finance. So after that, I have a question. Do you agree that intergovernmental politics are not marginal to traditional politics and should be treated as seriously as traditional politics? So do you think that intergovernmental politics should coexist and should be stay seen as something similar? Does anyone want to expand on that thought?
Hi, this is Crystal. So I definitely think that it should be what was the first question? Sorry, I said yes, but
it was, do you agree that intergovernmental politics are not marginal to traditional politics and should be treated as seriously as traditional politics?
Okay, yes. So I think that because these intergovernmental agencies have to coexist, we really should put a similar pressure or a similar emphasis because we're constantly having to deal with the federal, state, and local levels of government, and they're so interconnected and interdependent that there's no way for them to not exist together.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, but then who are the actors we are talking about? When we are speaking about intergovernment politics, right? We are representatives as government employees. We are the representative who are dealing with the politics. So are you advocating that we should be able to openly go and advocate certain political positions, Crystal?
I guess I meant it more in the sense of like putting that emphasis so we have more cohesion, because sometimes it does feel like things are very piecemeal together, or they sway one way in terms of politics and not another, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Because I am a member of the International City County Management Association. So one of the reasons, one of the bylaws states that as for my membership is that I cannot involve in myself in any politics. period. So I'm a little conflicted about this point at this moment, whether, because finally we are the actors involved in this, in running the government.
I think it more so means like how cities themselves will bypass laws to meet their goals, and specifically financially. So finding loopholes in the tax system or building like additional, I think there was something that she mentioned about like building another like quasi city to be able to circumvent tax policies in a way that benefit themselves. So that's what they meant by themselves being policy actors, not necessarily the traditional sense of like a mayor that's going to be like the face and that's going to be a politician out there. It's more so like behind the scenes on the administrative side, being able to work the system to be able to increase your goals and increase your funding for your city. All right, so in conclusion, the study argues that the politics of circumvention has played a key role in the intergovernmental politics of local capital investments. Her argument shows that governments are viewed as capable of using the legal and financial system to achieve their institutional goals. Intergovernmental politics are invisible, yet are entrenched in the American political system. She again says this because intergovernmental politics lack the interest that traditional politics have, so they tend to be invisible. But intergovernmental politics does have a huge impact, regardless of how invisible the politics may seem. And this invisibility of intergovernmental politics means that they're really rarely challenged by the traditional politics, even though they hold the power to help define what can be done and by which governments. And lastly, the author ends by noting that this is significant and troubling because so much of what government does and will be able to do is shaped by other governments rather than by citizens themselves. And that's my article.
Okay, thank you, Jocelyn. Very well done. I commend you for selecting this article because it is one of the more nuanced and like I like to refer to it, one of the more layered types of articles that we have. I think all your conclusions are exactly what the author found, and so I think you did a really nice job with that. There are a couple of passages in the article, and like you pointed out correctly, Jocelyn, this is an excerpt from a much larger piece from a book, and so there are some missing elements. We're just kind of seeing a little snapshot of the argument, but there are a couple of really important passages I think really kind of underscore some of the arguments that the author is making. One of those passages that I like a lot is on page 190 in the second full paragraph, where the author says, subnational officials in the United States work within a system in which their predecessors have made Faustian bargains in order to circumvent state restrictions while benefiting from federal tax exemption on local borrowing. They created new governmental entities that qualified for local borrowing, that qualified for the tax exemption. Essentially, what the author is saying is that these governments, in order to circumvent limitations being placed upon them by parent governments, and so state governments to avoid limitations placed upon them by the national government, or state governments to avoid, or local governments to avoid these limitations placed upon them by state governments, have made these Faustian bargains, which basically means a deal with the devil. And they've made this deal with the devil in order to afford themselves a little bit more flexibility. This in the literature is what's known as the paradox of tighter control. In the theory of the paradox of tighter control, as a parent government exerts more control over a subnational government, that will then have that subnational government start to spend more time and effort and resources to find ways to circumvent those tighter controls from the national government. So they'll get creative in coming up with ways to circumvent these rules and laws and regulations. When they effectively come up with a way to circumvent these laws, then the national government will then pass new laws and new regulations to stop them from doing these innovative things they come up with. And then they'll put even more time and effort into finding ways to circumvent these new regulations, these new rules. So it's kind of a tautological type of argument that as the federal government decides that it's going to try and limit the actions of state and local governments with tighter controls, all it's really doing is redirecting the efforts of those state and local governments to find ways to get around those tighter controls and those stricter rules and regulations. And just give a little bit of background about what happened leading up to an argument like this. For years, state and local governments were using a certain type of bond known as an industrial development bond, sometimes called an IDB. And industrial development bonds were used by state governments to lure businesses into their jurisdiction. So what the state or the local government would do is it would issue an industrial development bond, then use the proceeds of that bond to pay for maybe a business park or all the things that a corporation would need to start a business in that jurisdiction. And then say to these businesses, look, we set you up, we open up shop basically for you. All you have to do is move here, move your operations here, and you can benefit from all of the infrastructure we've already created for you. But the problem with that is that they were leveraging their tax exempt status as a municipality or a state government to lure these businesses, and were using proceeds from these tax exempt bonds to benefit businesses. And over the years, Congress got really tired of that. And in 1968, and then again in 1982, and then finally in 1986, Congress really dropped the hammer on these industrial development bonds in the Tax Reform Act. And what Congress did is Congress said, we're going to say that not all municipal debt is tax exempt. And I think we had talked about this briefly in a previous class, but one of the benefits for local or state governments is that when they issue debt, when they borrow money, the interest that investors earn on that debt is usually exempt from federal income taxes. Well, in 1986, the federal government said you can't do that anymore, that we're going to create two different categories of debt: public purpose debt that remains tax exempt, and then private activity debt that will no longer be tax exempt from income taxes. Well, when Congress did that and placed those limitations upon state and local governments, then state and local governments had to try and get creative again to try and circumvent those limitations coming out of the Tax Reform Act. And that's when you really start to get the development of a lot of these different types of bonds, such as lease rental bonds, sale leaseback bonds, lease revenue bonds, capital appreciation bonds. And so state and local governments really started to come up with really creative ways in order to avoid these limitations being placed upon their ability to issue debt by the national government. The problem again with that is not only did they create all these innovative types of debt, but as Spraj tells us in the article, they also set up governments, new governments or new types of governments to issue debt to allow them to get around federal restrictions. And so an example of a new government that can be set up is something like a JPA, a Joint Powers Authority. And most states have JPAs. Here in California, we have JPAs, we have joint financing authorities. And those JPAs, those joint financing authorities, can issue and reissue debt themselves as governmental entities that are established by either a city council or by a school district or by a sewer or water district. What Sprague is arguing here is the Faustian bargain, the deal with the devil, is that in order to get themselves more flexibility in being able to issue debt, they have created these new governments. And in doing so, yes, they've gotten themselves some flexibility, but they've also given up some of their authority and given up some of their power to these newly created entities. And that for not only Sprague, but also for some other authors such as Eleanor Ostrom at Arizona State, what this means is that there's a big question for deliberative democracy. Because if you have decisions that are being made by a city council or by a school district, the members of the city council and that school district are directly elected by the voters. And so citizens have a say. So at the city council meeting, citizens can show up and they have their public comment period and they can say whatever they want to that city council or to that school board. When it comes to a JPA or a joint financing authority, they also have meetings that are covered by the Brown Act and are ostensibly open to the public, but nobody comes because people don't really understand what that joint financing authority is doing, or the questions about what type of bond to issue and what the maturity date of that bond should be and what the coupon rate of that bond should be. Those are not really interesting types of issues. Those are not your traditional political issues that people get all jazzed up about and go to a meeting to talk about. And so I was the president of a joint finance authority for 2 years. And I'll tell you, we only met a couple of times a year, but our primary job was to issue and reissue debt for the community facilities districts, the CFDs, within our jurisdiction. And so the Joint Financing Authority was comprised of representatives from the elementary school district and the high school district, what we call the Union District and the Unified District. And so we reissued debt. I know we have one big issue where we took debt and we changed the maturity date, we refunded it, reissued it, and saved almost $1 million in interest savings. And nobody showed up. And in all those meetings I was president of, we never had one member of the public show up to any of those meetings. And I think that's what she's talking about with this intergovernmental politics. That's kind of more of a bloodless, less exciting type of politics than what you would normally see in traditional politics. And so citizens are more removed from participating in those types of intergovernmental politics than would be in a more traditional political system, such as what's happening in a city council or what's happening on a school board. Another really interesting passage that the author has is on page 191, where says the American system is characterized by a loose jointedness that perhaps paradoxically makes it difficult to erase history. It is difficult to mobilize the political resources necessary to change restrictions and laws. Circumvention is an easier strategy than a formal assault on constitutional provision or statute. So whenever you have these rules and these laws handed down from the national government, it's much more difficult to do a frontal assault on those rules and those laws than it is to just put your resources into trying to circumvent them. And that's what local governments have done. They put a lot of their energy to try and circumvent these rules and regulations, thus creating this whole bloodless system of intergovernmental politics, which raises questions for democracy. Because if you have the intergovernmental politics, all these decisions being made by more remote organizations like a JPA, citizens are going to be less involved. And citizens are then going to be less involved in their own governance than they would normally be in traditional politics. And then the final quote is from page 196, where the author says, intergovernmental politics enjoy ironic quality. They are invisible, yet they are entrenched in the American political system. They can seem bloodless when compared to politics as conventionally understood. In short, intergovernmental politics seem to lack the human interest that makes traditional accounts of urban politics so fascinating. Certainly, the creation of the revenue bond is not as stirring a story as the political battles that have raged around specific investments such as convention centers. The electorate was not involved in the creation of the revenue bond except as a factor to be excluded. So the author is kind of raising a red flag for us to be worried that the more we do these intergovernmental politics, the less likely it is that citizens will be involved in their own governance. I think that is more of a concern in other states than perhaps it is here in California. Because when we have JPAs and joint financing authorities, the representatives, the majority of the representatives on those JPAs and JFAs come directly from elected bodies. And so there is an accountability mechanism there to hold them accountable for their actions. The problem is their actions are much less visible on a joint powers authority or a joint financing authority than they would be sitting on a school board in a school board meeting or sitting in a city council meeting. And I think that's the concern that Spraja, Ostrom, and others have about this system of intergovernmental politics. But I've talked enough about it, so I'll stop talking. But there's so much in this article. That's why it's one of the best articles, I think, in the book, and certainly one of the most layered articles. And so thank you, Jocelyn, for selecting it. I really do appreciate that. If you haven't spent much time reading this article, I do recommend you go back and take a look at it again, because there is so much good information in this article, especially in terms of this idea of intergovernmental politics, this kind of bloodless battle that goes on among administrators and sometimes elected officials that's oftentimes done outside the purview of the public and of citizens. So very well done. Thank you, Jocelyn. And like I said, I'll shut up now. So we've got this system of intergovernmental politics going on in terms of financing. And, again, this project article is all placed within the context of municipal bonds and that aspect of financing. The next article is placed within the context of grants and aid, and a specific type of grant and aid known as a categorical grant. Those categorical grants are those specific grants of money for specific types of purposes, with a good bit of strings and a good bit of accountability requirements for how that money will be spent. So the wide categorical grants article, Crystal, did you want to lead a discussion on that one, or would you prefer I do it?
No, I can do it tonight. Yeah, I just don't have a camera, but I can lead the discussion with my slides.
Okay, perfect. I'll turn it over to you then for wide categorical grants.
Okay, perfect. Cool. Okay, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I can't see anything anymore. Okay. So good evening, everyone. Tonight, I will be leading the discussion on the Article Y categorical grants, which looks at the fiscal aspects of intergovernmental relations. Similar to Jocelyn's article, this is an excerpt from a larger body of work by the United States Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. So today, okay, there it goes. Tonight we'll be covering some of the alternative patterns of federalism, which have been adopted by other advanced democracies and not by the United States. We'll continue with the theme of federalism in the American context, including dual federalism. And then we'll break down some of the economic and fiscal factors, as well as the political factors, which have driven the expansion of categorical grants in the United States. And these are inclusive of the conceptual framework explaining spillovers or externalities that occur in the provision of many state and local government services, and the influences of the philosophical traditions and features of the American political system. So the alternative patterns of federalism, the development of American federalism since the Civil War, which settled a lot of the fundamental issues in the early formation of the country, is in large part the story of this expanding system of categorical aids. The features of American federalism are quite different from those of other advanced democracies with federal constitutions. And some of these alternative patterns of federalism include financial self-sufficiency on the part of state and local governments, direct performance by the national government of all its domestic functions, clear distinction between national and subnational services and responsibilities, and then general support for the equalization of states' fiscal capacities and service levels. So other countries have adopted all of these kind of components in their federalism in their respective countries. But federalism in the United States is quite different. So the framers of the Constitution purposefully created ambiguity surrounding the respective roles of the national and state government at the time. But this also left many of the most important questions kind of unresolved. And we've seen many changes take place in American intergovernmental relations as a result, especially under the influence of various political, economical, and social factors. So the Constitution seemingly divided responsibilities between the two levels of government according to subject. So certain functions, for example, interstate commerce and national defense, were assigned to the national authority, but then many others, such as the selection of presidential electors, were left to the states. And what's more is that the 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights basically asserts that the power not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or reserved to the people. But the same Constitution also provides conflicting cues by authorizing the National Congress to provide for the general welfare and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for executing this and the other powers given to the legislature, but determining what constitutes either general welfare or which laws are necessary and proper are inherently political questions. So it's no surprise that when you ask different people throughout different times in history, there is no consistent answer in terms of what constitutes general welfare or which laws are necessary and proper. So then now, as we all know, the federal government is a government of delegated powers. So this means that it has only those powers authorized by the Constitution. All other powers, as the 10th Amendment reads, are reserved to the states or to the people. And then although the powers delegated to the federal government may be exclusive, meaning that they may be exercised only by the federal government, they can also be concurrent, meaning that they can be exercised by both the federal and state governments alike. So it makes deciding which powers are exclusive and which are concurrent a really difficult and kind of this continuous undertaking. And then we have this idea of dual federalism. So here, each of the two levels of government operate independently within their own separate jurisdiction without relying on the other for assistance or even authorization. And this notion of dual federalism influenced the decisions of the Supreme Court pretty much until the early decades of the 20th century. So during the 1800s, we saw various presidents vetoing legislation that would have created a larger federal presence in policy fields. So like public works construction. Lost my thought in my notes, sorry. On the grounds that the Constitution simply didn't permit the federal government with such national involvement. And they felt that those kinds of powers were supposed to be reserved for the states. In other fields, such as education or social policy, dual federalism was the primary view of state and federal intergovernmental relations, but we have certainly since moved away from that a little bit and have kind of melded more in terms of the intergovernmental agencies and how they correspond and react to one another. So the article introduces a new conceptual framework in terms of economic and fiscal factors. We know from the early part of the book that there's taxes and the Great Depression and all these factors that kind of happen throughout history, but this new framework is believed to have caused major growth in categorical aids, and it involves the acknowledgement of what economists refer to as spillovers, or also known as externalities, that occur in the provision of services provided by many state and local governments. So essentially, the flow of benefits from public programs are not necessarily restricted to residents or constituents of the jurisdiction that provides and finances these public services through its tax base. So there is some form of spillover to other residents of, let's say, nearby areas, or to anybody from the general public for that matter. Some examples of spillovers include wastewater treatment. So in this case, the beneficiaries of cleaner water are often those who live downstream from a given source of pollution. Another example would be highways. So highways carry a large volume of interstate traffic. And this is a state program that benefits residents and non-residents alike. And then lastly, we have higher education as another example of spillover. Because of the frequency that college students attend schools in other states, or because of the frequency of college graduates migrating to other states in search of work. The drawback in these situations is that the amount of public services provided will be inadequate because local voters and taxpayers pretty much have no incentive to pay for activities that benefit others and not themselves. So grants aimed at correcting these spillovers are usually categorical in nature and would be necessary even if a state or locality possessed a really strong fiscal base like California. But even still, this theory has been widely accepted, but also subject to vast criticisms because it is based on the somewhat weak assumption that state and local governments are more familiar with the needs and priorities of their respective constituencies, and they know what's best, essentially, to maximize the economic welfare within their respective jurisdiction. So we also have this argument which suggests that many existing grants are not actually based on the principle of spillovers or externalities. And so it's kind of becomes this like ongoing discussion that pretty much no one can really come to an agreement on. So then we move on to our political factors. So grants have offered the opportunity for substantial expansion of federal influence over state and local governments. And there have been a number of important political and administrative consequences that flow from this fact. So the categorical grant program appears to be an expression of basic American political ideologies and institutions. So we have some important influences based on the attitudes of federal officials, the structure and procedures of Congress, and the social and political diversity of the population in the United States. So one political interpretation of grants and aid is evident in the observation of interest group operations. If an interest group lacks sufficient strength to gain all of its objectives in either state capitals or in Congress alone, this shared program responsibility comes about where federal funding is provided to the states for them to administer at their own discretion. And then we also have this notion of federal distrust. So categorical aid programs have been encouraged by the attitudes shared by many officials in the federal executive and legislative branches. One perspective is that if a specific government raises money through taxation, that same government should also have complete control over how those monies are spent or distributed. Another kind of more extreme view is that there is this deep distrust on the part of the federal government surrounding the intentions, performance, and the general competence of state, municipal, and county governments, which I thought was pretty interesting given the fact that it's in terms of politics, it's always, you know, distrust of the federal government because they're so large. Then we have congressional influence. So this has also formed certain features of the heavy use of categorical grants where this specialization is a dominant feature in our modern day Congress. So we have like the House of Representatives. The power is very concentrated at the committee and subcommittee levels. And so specialized policymaking has kind of become the norm. And those thought to be subject matter experts in any given field are seated at these committee tables. We have this idea of log rolling where individual members of Congress seek out specific committee assignments that pertain to their own interests, and then, of course, the interests of their constituents in a bid for securing re-election. If they are able to get into a committee that is of their interest and it gets passed, and the bill is enacted, then all of a sudden these people come in and, you know, they're saying, okay, well, I got us what you wanted, it's time for re-election. One major consequence of these practices is that in many fields, the decision-making process by the committees pretty much goes unchallenged, because the committee is made up of the subject matter experts, and so other members of Congress don't really either know or want to challenge the subject matter experts. So the congressional committees, especially in the House of Representatives, they're pretty much largely free to develop the administrative particulars in terms of planning requirements, recipient administration, funding allocations, and so on. So they have complete control from the time the committee is formed to the time that legislation or concerning categorical grant funding is passed. Then finally, we have social pluralism in the United States, which has also impacted the nature of public policy, because we are so socially diverse in terms of cultural and economic groups. And we can see this in the example of education, which was the first area pretty much to begin receiving federal assistance. So today, the variety of categorical education programs, there's so many, and it illustrates the inability of supporters to agree upon a general system of support. So instead of having this kind of general system, we have this categorical system. And despite attempts to create a more generalized federal aid program for educational institutions across the country, there's still this division among advocates, even infighting amongst themselves for federal aid to education, which makes passage impossible, especially with religion and race kind of making up the most divisive issues, because we are so, again, socially diverse in terms of like all the different cultures that we have. And so when we have these different groups that pretty much are all vying for the same thing in terms of supporting this general system of support for education, they have all of these competing interests in terms of beliefs and things of that nature. So it really has kind of driven an increased use throughout our nation's history, going from, where it was just this ambiguous separation of powers to now becoming so interconnected, as as we were discussing during Jocelyn's presentation. So your turn. I have true or false, just to make sure everyone was paying attention. And the first question is, the Constitution does not allow powers to be exercised by both the federal and state governments. Is this true or false? And feel free to chat or put it in the chat, excuse me. Yeah. See a bunch of falses. That is the correct answer. I see a flays in there. Just kidding, Owen. So then we have, if anybody can provide their own example of a spillover, you can shout it out, put it in the chat. But is there anything, so aside from the ones that I provided, can anybody think of a spillover where perhaps somebody, if I, live in Torrance, let's say, and I were to go over to Redondo Beach, something, is there anything in terms of an example that anybody can provide?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Kamara. Yeah.
Hi, so the city I live in right now is Fresno. It's unique because it has county islands in the middle of the city. So a lot of the spillovers would just be citizens paying or enjoying certain services that the city offers that the county may not offer. The Fresno County doesn't have any sidewalks in those areas, so you can tell what neighborhood you're in by essentially they don't the agency does not maintain or have any sidewalks for the residential areas.
Wow.
So I guess you said that'd be a spillover.
Yeah, yeah. And as homelessness becomes a larger and larger issue, homeless services provided by municipalities or county governments. I mean, pretty much anybody can go and receive homeless services, but just as another example. Then we have, so congressional influence has helped the US move away from categorical grants. Is this true or false? Kind of a tricky question, but the answer is false. Okay, and then since we just did our discussion post on interest groups, can anyone provide their own example of interest group influence in terms of trying to obtain categorical funding, or if they don't have the means to get it from just one level of government, if they branch out to federal governments, lobbying the federal government, which then in turn gives funding to states? Okay, I can provide my own example. So we have the League of California Cities that is basically representative of all of its membership cities in the state of California. And if they cannot obtain infrastructure funding or lobby for infrastructure funding from the state, then they turn around and lobby the federal government for those categorical funds. And I think they just started to roll out a new infrastructure bill, which they successfully lobbied on behalf of city governments. So essentially what will happen is the federal government will provide funding to states, and then the states will provide funding to cities to try to expand public transportation, bridges, streets, those kinds of projects. So all right, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Very well done. Thank you very much. And yeah, I think that, I don't want to step on the toes of the Moneypenny article too much that we'll do next week, because there is a great deal of overlap between these two articles. But just a couple of things on this one, just to reiterate what Crystal had talked about. This is an article by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. This is the ACIR is something that's no longer around. The ACIR went out of existence in 1996. And one of the reasons why it went out of existence is because it produced a draft report that used to be part of the O'Toole textbook, and they took it out, the most recent edition. But it was a draft report that was very critical of some of the mandates that were passed by Congress. And so Congress got wind of that, didn't like that, zeroed them out, took away all their funding, and that's how the ACIR went away. But this article, as Crystal told us, ACIR is basically trying to ask that simple question of why categorical grants. We tend to have a lot of categorical grants in this country. Those categorical grants are those very specific grants where the money must be spent in specific ways, again, with a lot of specific reporting requirements and accountability standards. And then, as Crystal had up there on her screen, there are a lot of explanations that the ACAR put forth, and most of those explanations have some validity to them. There are also some problems with some of those explanations as well. So, as Crystal said, one of the first explanations, the existence of spillovers and externalities. And certainly, when there are spillovers and externalities, that gives us a reason for government involvement. Whenever I teach the public budgeting class, one of the first places we start in public budgeting is a discussion of the quote-unquote proper role of government in intervening in the economy. And one of the reasons why we put forth that the public sector intervenes in the economy besides market failure is the presence of externalities, the presence of spillovers. The problem with spillovers is that, especially with positive externalities or positive spillovers, is you have free riders, who are people who are getting benefits without paying the cost of this program or this good or service. It's difficult for us to quantify the amount of benefit that these folks are getting in terms of spillovers because they're not paying for it. And so it's difficult to say that categorical grants are solely the result of trying to correct spillovers, because we oftentimes don't know what those spillovers are. We don't know the magnitude and scope of those spillovers. And so if you don't know the magnitude and scope of spillovers, it's difficult to design a grant program to mitigate those types of spillovers. Certainly we have interest groups, and we talked about Federalist number 10 and the idea of factions. We have interest groups in this country. You talked about an interest group of your choice in your beach board posting for this past week. So we know that whenever we have interest groups, especially traditional interest groups that advocate for certain policies and certain programs, that advocacy is probably going to result in some type of a more specific approach to resolving that problem. And we oftentimes get categorical grants out of some of this issue-specific advocacy that we see from interest groups. So there's probably some truth to that. The federal distrust argument is an interesting one, in that we know that in the Johnson administration, we talked about the different eras of federalism. In the Johnson administration in the 1960s, the Johnson administration was waging its war on poverty and was trying to create this great society. And one of the primary tools the Johnson administration used were these categorical grants. And one of the reasons why they used categorical grants is because they distrusted state and local governments. They felt that they just gave money to state and local governments with no strings attached. State and local governments wouldn't use that money to promote the goals and objectives of the Great Society and the war on poverty. So in order to make sure that they spent the money the way they needed to spend the money to achieve national objectives, you got these very specific categorical grants. So I do think there's that kind of federal distrust. And when you think about the era of creative federalism and when that was occurring at the height of Jim Crow laws in southern states. That was occurring at the height of attempts by southern states to stop desegregation. And so, yes, there was a good deal of distrust from the federal government. And that distrust oftentimes went both ways between state and federal governments. Congressional influence, and Crystal talked about this one as well. I think this one probably goes a long way to helping explain categorical grants. And with congressional influence, we talk a lot about the casework that members of Congress do. And then members of Congress, their primary goal is to get reelected. And David Mayhew in his Congress, the Electoral Connection book from a few decades ago, tells us that members of Congress, their primary goal is to get reelected, and they get reelected by taking positions on issues. They get reelected by advertising to increase their name recognition and name recall. But they most prominently get reelected through credit claiming. They claim credit for things that are beneficial to their constituents. And so when you get these specific categorical grants, those are easier to claim credit for success with than if you had something that's much more broad and much more general. And just the way Congress works also lends itself toward more specific actions such as categorical grants. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there were a series of reforms in both the House of Representatives and the Senate to empower subcommittees and to create more legislative specialization. In the 1960s, because of civil rights legislation, some of your members of the House and the Senate from the South started looking and behaving a lot more like their northern counterparts. And so what they wanted is they wanted to have more power. And a lot of these committee chairs were, your holdovers from a previous era. They had been in Congress for a very long time. They no longer believed or looked a lot like the new representatives that were being elected in southern states because of civil rights legislation. And so you got this challenge against these committee chairs. And one way to challenge the power of a committee chair is by empowering subcommittees. So we've got what we're called the Hansen Amendments in the US House and the Stevenson Amendments in the US Senate that created a subcommittee Bill of Rights, granting jurisdiction, guaranteed jurisdiction over certain issue areas to subcommittees. And once you empower those subcommittees, you are further specializing focus. And so you get even more of that expert focus that Crystal talked about in her discussion. And when you have more of that specialization, more of that expert focus, more of that power with subcommittees, that is going to lead to more of a specialization of the grants that come out of Congress as well. And so I think it goes a long way to explaining a lot of these more specific categorical grants. And then as Crystal told us, another explanation is social pluralism. Whenever you have a pluralistic society and people have the opportunity and the avenue to participate in their own governance. What Martin Grodson told us was the multiple crack theory, that there are multiple cracks by which people can participate in their own governance. When you have that type of a pluralistic system, then you're by definition going to end up with more specific types of grants and mandates. The political science literature really was divided for many years on this idea of pluralism versus elitism. And I think we had mentioned this class before, but in the 1960s, Robert Dahl advocated for pluralism in his study, that people, if they were interested enough in an issue, they had avenues to participate in making decisions on that issue. Floyd Hunter, writing in the 1970s, looked at Atlanta, Georgia, and came to the opposite conclusion. And he came to the conclusion that in Atlanta, Georgia, it was very elitist decision-making, where only a small cadre of the top elected officials and the top members from big corporations in the city, it was only those folks who made decisions across a whole broad spectrum of policy issues. I think we'd like to think of ourselves as being more pluralistic than elitist in nature. I don't know how true it is, but I think that's how we like to envision ourselves as a political culture. And the more pluralistic your political culture is, the more likely it is that more groups and more individuals will have the opportunity to participate. And the more they participate, the more likely they are to be successful at getting what they want accomplished, which means that they will get these specific grants for specific types of programs and policies that they are advocating for. So I think the argument here with ACR is it's really a confluence of a variety of different political factors that give us these categorical grants. And we'll see this again as we talk about the Moneypenny article next week, but it's kind of categorical grants are kind of a natural outgrowth of our pluralistic political system and the way in which Congress is designed and the way in which Congress operates. But wherever these categorical grants come from, they're certainly very prevalent in fiscal federalism, even though some of them have been replaced over the past couple of decades with broader block grants. There's still very, very common devices that the national government can use to get the compliance of state and local governments in achieving national goals and objectives. So thank you, Crystal, very much for that. Again, I think that this is a good article for kind of giving us that rationale for why we have these things called categorical grants. I see that we are at 7:10 right now. So if everyone's amenable, let's go ahead and take about a 10-minute break. And we'll come back at 7:20. When we come back at 7:20, I'll turn the floor over to Jake to talk about the Bernori article. And then we'll have Luis wrap up the show tonight with a discussion of the economics of intergovernmental grants. So take about 10 minutes, come back at 7:20, and we'll have Jake on deck and ready to go. Okay, it's 7:20, so we are back. I see Jake's got his slides all loaded up and ready to go. So I'll turn the floor over to Jake and discussion of the Bernori article.
Awesome. Okay, can you hear me and see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today we'll be going over the article Financing Local Government in a Changing World by David Brunori. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. The article discusses the financial challenges to local government finance through technological advancement, international trade, and the deregulation of utilities, which will cause constraints on different tax policies. Additionally, local governments will operate in an environment shaped by constantly changing demographics. In particular, the article mentions the aging population. So while the world has changed rapidly, the tax systems that support all levels of government have largely stayed the same. Brunori actually suggests that without radical changes, many types of taxes that will not be sufficient in raising revenue in the 21st century for state and local governments. So before we get into the content, I am curious, in your opinion, which one of the following, or which one of the challenges that you see on the screen, A, B, C, or D, do you personally think would be the most challenging to overcome? You can just type a letter in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like to comment on particularly why you think that might be the most challenging. I'm sure a lot of us are just getting back from break. It's been a long day. Totally get it. Honestly, a lot of these are going to be challenging, right? So anyone that did comment, would anyone like to talk about why you think it might be the most challenging to overcome?
I would say technological advances is the most challenging thing to overcome because the technology has changed so rapidly and it is evolving that the governments are not able to keep up with it, including the legal, including policing. You know, even at this point, we have failed to bring a good, say like for cryptocurrency, we had a big crash of cryptocurrency exchanges, which is not properly regulated. That's one. And now we're talking about technological advances. We are talking about bringing in robots as police officers. And how are we going to create accountability for that? You know, things like that. And also, um, there is a lot of unmanned UAVs flying around, and how are we going to regulate them? And in the airspace is going to be really fulfilled. And then with technological advances, things are going to get very cheap because of chip developments. So technology is going to also overrun you in many ways. And then where are we going to put all those trash? You know, it's going to also pile up a lot of electronic waste.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing, Faisal. I appreciate it. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into our first one, globalism/international trade. So the United States has worked diligently to encourage international trade by entering into agreements that will reduce barriers and also encourage commerce across national borders. However, the issue of globalism/international trade is due to the increase in individual and capital mobility, which is that ability for capital to move from one country to another. Part of the increase in international trade is going to be attributable to an increase in the individual and capital mobility, but falling trade barriers and dramatic reductions in communications and transportation costs will also significantly increase the capital mobility. With that high mobility, there will be competitive advantage given to entice investors. To stay competitive, state and local governments will really have to compete with each other to lower the tax burdens related to business activities and really create that competitive tax environment. So the ability of companies and individuals to sell products and services around the world makes compliance and administration of some taxes, particularly those imposed on mobile basis, more difficult and expensive. So another question here, you can type it in the chat box. What country do you believe is the largest trade partner with the United States? Go ahead and just like throw an answer out there. Promise I'm not going to judge anyone. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of China, Canada, Mexico. So I was quite surprised. Faisal, you're totally right. It looks like Mexico and Canada are top two and really have overtaken China. So our top three trade partners for the United States are Mexico, then Canada, then China. In 2019, Mexico and Canada overtook China as the top trading partners. However, this was not the case prior to 2019 or prior to the pandemic. So what do you believe attributed to Mexico becoming the top trading partners in 2019? What different things might have happened? NAFTA.
Maybe the cost of transportation goods, being that they're in the same continent.
Sure. Outsourcing. We had the pandemic, right? So thank you, Lizette. I was gonna say supply chain issues potentially. One big thing I did notice from my research, and Owen kind of hit on the nail on the head, is with NAFTA. So between 2018 and 2020, President Donald Trump terminated the NAFTA kind of agreement and entered into a trade deal with Mexico and Canada, which increased our total imports and exports with those two countries compared to China. While this was greatly an impact on the trade, I am slightly curious of what the other aspects. Was it outsourcing? Was it supply chain issues? Was it the pandemic? And how that might have affected the overall imports and exports with all of the US trade partners. So with the growth of international trade, it will be really inefficient and ineffective means of raising local government revenue. But what do you think, as future public administrators working in local governments or state or county governments, that we can do to increase revenue when facing these challenges? What are some things that you believe would be effective? I've come up with two that we're going to talk about, but I'm interested to see if anyone else has thought of these same things or have seen things in their own agencies that they work for. And like I said, feel free to put them in the chat box, or if you'd like to say them, you can unmute yourself and talk about them real quick. Either is totally fine with me. I can talk all day if I need to, but I'm more than willing to have a conversation. Tax sharing agreements, okay. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and move into some of the two. Tourism targeted taxation, awesome. Yeah, I mean, as future public administrators, this is going to be something that we are going to face. We are going to have to take head on in order to really curb the challenge of raising revenue for our agencies, especially in local government, when this is going to be a challenge that we are going to face. So the first one that I thought of is tax measures, right? So I personally work for the city of Fountain Valley, and in 2016, Measure HH was created, which is a tax measure with a 20-year term. It was a 1 cent transaction tax increase. And this was voted and approved. And the projected increase, I just pulled the numbers from 2020/21 fiscal year, was 11.2 million, just with that 1 cent transaction tax increase. Oh, thank you, Faisal. So, this is something that the city of Fountain Valley went for, right? They tried to raise additional revenue. It's not a permanent fix though, however, because it does have that time period on it. But I'm interested to see out there, and a lot of you work for other cities or you live in different cities than I do. What other cities have you heard of implementing tax measures, not just raising their taxes, but just kind of like a term tax measure? And do you feel like those are being successful?
Yeah, I mean, here in Malibu, in the most recent election, we just had a half cent tax increase, and basically the advocacy for it was just to kind of increase general revenue for the city to be able to support a variety of different programs like homelessness initiatives and policies. Funds for our volunteers on patrol for the sheriff's department, being that it's a contract city. So a lot of, obviously all of our services are outsourced that way. And so, that passed with a pretty widely. So I think folks are, they were in support of that, tax measure, just to be able to garner more resources for continued community development, even though there's not that many organizations in the city. I think, the few that we do have, there's a good amount of resources there to be able to support their efforts. And of course, which improves the city overall in that standpoint.
Now, is that a permanent increase or a temporary with a term?
It's fixed for a period of a year.
Okay. Oh,
Yes.
just 1 year, you said?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always has to be a logical, reason. I know with City of Fountain Valley, a lot of their focus on the reason for the increased measure was more about safety. It was kind of, a lot of people think it was like threatening, like, oh, we're going to shut down one of the fire stations, which will greatly impact, response times without this measure. Some people feel like it was threatening tactics to get it approved. Some people felt like there was, legitimate reasoning to need this increase. However, I do believe it is quite unclear at this moment if it is going to be a saving grace for the city of Fountain Valley, or really for any city, or if it's just a temporary fix. During that period, all that revenue will be increased. Budgets will be increased to accommodate for different items, or they'll use that increased revenue to replace different equipment, whether it's like replacing a fire engine, or increasing budgets, increasing salaries for employees. But I do think it's kind of problematic because these employees, these cities, these programs that this additional funding is going towards, they're going to be comfortable, they're going to be used to these. And how are we going to be able to still maintain the expenditures that cost for those once that revenue is decreased after that term is over? So I am curious to see what the level of success is after the 20-year period, and if they really were able to use that time to really pay down any debt that they owe, and really make sure that they're setting themselves up for successful once that term has ended. Okay, so another one, and I think Owen mentioned this one in the comment box, which is kind of tourism. We learned about this one of our earlier classes. I can't remember exactly which one it was, is tourism improvement districts, TIDs. So Anaheim does have a tourism improvement district, which was adopted by the City of Anaheim City Council in a resolution in 2010. And I thought it was really interesting. So I'm going to read some of the things the resolution talks about. It says the resolution states that the purpose of the ATID is to, 1, provide for the current marketing and promotion efforts necessary to attract new conventions to the Anaheim Convention Center. 2, promote and attract new visitors to the benefited hotels in the city. 3, help fund the planning, design, construction, and operation of the transit improvements, which will deliver visitors to and from the hotels, and I believe it was the railroad station. 4, provide for improvements, security, and other benefits needed within the ATID area. And 5, facilitate the rededication of funds currently allocated from the city's general fund to the Anaheim Orange County Visitor and Convention Bureau. And all of this is in order to facilitate the rapid expansion of the Anaheim Convention Center and Plaza. So, Anaheim is sitting here trying to reallocate funds, readdress different things, improve marketing resources, improve the transportation, and really trying to use the taxes while they can to promote tourism, which they're hoping will in turn increase overall revenue for tourists being attracted to Anaheim. And obviously there's Disneyland in Anaheim, but by making transportation more accessible and easy to get around the city will definitely help, hopefully. And I think it's been going pretty well. The convention center always seems to be booked in Anaheim, so that might be something that other cities will look to in the future if that is plausible for them to really focus on tourism and bringing that into their city. All right, jumping to the next challenge that Brenori brings up, which is technological advances. This is the one that Faisal said would be super challenging. I think someone else mentioned it. I could be wrong, maybe it was Owen. So technological advances, have allowed for the creation of new businesses, new business modules, new services, and remote activities. The ability to purchase goods and services through the internet has sharply reduced reliance on sales tax. Although this problem is much more serious for state than for local governments, it calls into question whether local governments can view sales tax as an adequate source of revenue. And that's what Brenori mentions in the textbook. Brenori also suggests that with advancement in mobility and technological advances, state and local governments will be less reliable to business taxes and business property taxes for revenue. So, it really does bring up the question, can local governments view sales tax as an adequate source of revenue during these technological advanced ages? And so I wanted to bring this up again. Lots of questions here, hopefully lots of good feedback on your part, but what company or ideas do you think have shown recent technological advances? Or what are things that you did in your jobs during COVID-19 that utilized technology to be able to conduct business during a period of time when it was much harder to? And like I said, feel free to drop in the comment, or if anyone wants to go ahead and unmute and talk about it. I can't see hands, so if anyone's raising hands to talk, just go ahead and jump in because I will not be able to see that on my screen. Teleworking, absolutely.
We don't have a business, but as a nonprofit, we were able to move a lot of our programs online.
Mhm.
Because if we didn't show any sort of work being done in the community, we didn't really have an excuse with our donors. So they were still donating to us. So we moved all of our programs online, which was interesting for our summer camp program, but we did it. But we had some online symposiums and educational workshops, doctors attending. We had a lot of tech help to help us pull this off. We even had like game and fun nights with kids, and we would mail them packages of supplies for arts and crafts and different things like that, and administer programs online for that. So the tech factor was key there. And we were able to even secure sponsors for these events and do like sponsor placement on our website and in social media. And I think just extreme creativity.
Yeah, absolutely. I work in Parks and Recreation. And so the ability to be in person is huge as part of that. So we also did, online Zoom summer camps. We did camp out from home, and we delivered camp out kits to like 200 people houses, and they camped out together all virtually and watched the same videos together. And so technological advances are, while they, in this textbook and this article, they are something that are to not be ignored for fear of how it affects sales taxes. It also some really great things that we were able to utilize during the pandemic so that we were able to function in general. Lizette mentioned teleworking, Faisal mentioned Zoom. All of those things allowed us to continue to operate. And I think they're important things for us to recognize. Two things I believe also, not just like COVID related. I mean, one of them is kind of COVID related, but one is just technological advances in general. I think an excellent example of technological advances is Tesla. I don't know how many of us here have a Tesla. I do not have a Tesla, but Tesla does not operate through dealerships like traditional car companies, right? They're more kind of a retail store, focus a lot on those online sales where you can go and just talk with customer services, order a car or order it online yourself from your computer without having to go anywhere. And the car is made in a warehouse and then just gets delivered to you. This mobility does allow for Tesla to move their retail shops kind of anywhere that presents them that competitive tax advantage, or even go completely online in the future for customer service. There may not even be a need for Tesla to have those retail shops, and that's really going to kind of confuse that line more and more, with less, property business taxes from having like firm locations as a revenue base. That will definitely start to impact and affect revenue for local and state governments. And then during COVID-19, I know I used Target Drive Up a lot. I'm sure several people in the class today also used it, or Amazon. Those were some positive technological advances that Target was able to utilize, but also we were able to utilize to still get those products. I think one thing I really like about the Drive Up compared to just Amazon is the ability to online shop and still receive those items within the same day, versus like, you know, not just like unperishable goods or perishable goods, just kind of, you know, anything. Like, I know a lot of my friends like boosted their video game play, and so they were able to buy those like video games that they wanted or whatever and got them much quicker. And so I think that was definitely one thing that was a successful and a positive part of technological advances that we saw during COVID. And I know, like Lizette mentioned, teleworking, remote working. So, you know, the technological advances of remote working, they are great. First of all, if you have been given them, I personally was not given that benefit at all during COVID. I was in the office the entire time. But it can have an impact as it becomes less clear on wage taxes and how to proceed with caution to avoid businesses. This is actually something that Brenori mentions, to avoid caution from businesses finding opportunities to avoid wage or payroll taxes. And I did find another peer review article from an Agrawal and Stark. And in the article called, Will the Remote Work Revolution Undermine Progressive State Income Taxes? It suggests several approaches how we can kind of curb the fear of remote working and how that's going to affect taxes. So the first one it mentions is one, source to the employee's physical workplace. So this is going to be sourcing the income to the state where the employee physically performs the services. Two, source to the employer's location. So sourcing the income to the state where the benefit of the employee's service is received. And I guess before I got to these, I probably should have mentioned, this is totally my fault. They're talking a lot about the idea of the interstate employees. I know I have several friends that live in one state, work in a different state, and kind of how that's going to balance with those taxes. I don't know if anyone here does that same thing. I think we had a professor that lived in a different state. I could be wrong. I think he like lived in Arizona, but he was also teaching us here through a California school. So some of those things could be things that need to be considered. The third one is kind of a combination of both. And so it's subjecting remote teleworkers to a single uniform federal income tax, where the proceeds of which would be shared among the states according to some predetermined formula. I didn't kind of mention a formula, it was more of just kind of a concept, but you know, between those two states of where they live and where they work, having some sort of formula of how those taxes would be divided. And this definitely would require intergovernmental relations between federal, states, varying states, to kind of work together to ensure appropriate distribution of wage taxes for remote workers that are interstate workers. You know, these interstate workers are becoming more and more common. And honestly, I feel like a lot of employees really look for those companies that are allowing them to have that remote work access. I know I have several friends who have left jobs recently purely to work for companies where they get to work completely from home or wherever they want. They can go on vacation and work from there. And it's definitely becoming not only like an advantage to being in certain jobs, but it could considerably be a disadvantage as we look into potentially losing significant wage revenues. Jumping into the next one, deregulation. So compared with unregulated businesses, regulated industries have traditionally been subject to higher property and other tax burdens. Local governments collect tax on gas, electricity, and telecommunication utilities that are set at more than double the rate imposed on other industries. And that's at least what Brenori said. But overall, the deregulation movement will likely reduce utility revenue as well as curb property tax revenue. The expected reduction in overall local government revenues will be modest, but any additional undermining of already weak traditional local tax bases could cripple local governments' ability to finance services. And then the last one of the challenges that Brenori mentions is an aging population. So the aging population and how they vote will greatly impact policy and government. Brenori states that the aging population is only willing to vote in ways that impact them. Particularly for this example that Brenori suggests, the example given was that funding for an increased public education budget would be through increasing property tax. And maybe since that older population does not have children in the public school system, they may not be as willing to vote yes, or they may not care because it doesn't impact them or their family, and kind of how their voting patterns will reflect that they would not vote for an increase in that fund because it greatly impacts their property tax. In particular, Bernori says property taxes are unpopular with senior citizens because of the fear that they will lose their homes, and if they're unable to pay property taxes, because one way to enforce the property tax is to seize the property if they do not pay. A home, often the most valuable financial asset owned by senior citizens, has immeasurable psychological and emotional value. The thought of losing such an asset adds to homeowners' dislike of the property tax and greatly increases stress as well. So I'm interested to hear what people have to say. Like I said, put it in the comment, unmute yourself. But do you agree or disagree that the aging population, or in general, any population, be more or less likely to vote purely on how it affects them financially? Yes, no, why or why not? Do you agree or disagree? Faisal, yes, okay.
I'll chime in. I agree to a certain extent. I think there are altruistic people out there, but I think in general, the consensus is that as we age, we tend to lean more conservative. And I think they're talking more about fiscal policy than social policy. And I saw, I'm Gen X. So yeah, Gen X. And I saw some things like, oh, Gen X grew up like these rebels and, screw the system type people. And they've now grown into a more conservative base, obviously depending on geography and income level. But I think that who knows, maybe that's just a product of any aging population as they acquire assets and resources, and also fear. Like we're dealing with putting my in-laws in an assisted living facility, and the only asset they have is their home, and it's not really a luxury, it's survival. So I don't think it's purely selfishness so much as our country may demand that you make these decisions based on survival. But I think, yeah, in general, we might say that as you age, my aunt was a hippie, and then they all grew up to be pretty conservative too.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I didn't want it to seem like it was meant to be a blanket statement, because you're right, there are going to be altruistic people out there, but there are going to be people who are definitely voting based on how it affects their pockets, especially as you get older and your opportunities for increased revenue, personal income become limited. We're doing the same thing with my grandfather. He has dementia, he's had to move in with here, and his greatest value and asset was his home. And now he no longer has that, and he views it a complete loss in his life. So, it could be something that greatly does impact. And I think Faisal brings up a great point in the chat. He says, they have time to go out and advocate. And that is true. They have less potentially going on in their lives. They don't have maybe a steady 9 to 5, Monday through Friday job. So they have more of that disposable time to go out there and communicate and talk and advocate for, maybe their viewpoint on why a policy should pass or not pass. Definitely great to bring up, Faisal. All right, and then the last the article talks about is the future/new economy. So the changing economy will have significant effects on local government taxation. Local governments have never succeeded in raising money from taxing mobile capital, services, or intangibles. That's what Bernori says, but I want to add in yet. We could still figure something out if we needed to make sure that public administration does not greatly be impacted by the decrease in revenue. And it also says that no local government has devised a workable method for taxing these components in the new economy for the future. Globalization, international trade, and technological developments will make it more difficult to rely on sales and income taxes. But in this regard, the rising importance of mobility will likely lead to increased efforts to figure out how to tax, the immobile basis. The difficulty in taxing mobile basis leaves only property taxes and user fees as viable sources of revenue for local governments. And these sources of revenue allow for fiscal and political autonomy. So I definitely believe that this article brought up a lot of great points for us as future public administrators, and really is kind of allowing us to begin thinking now of how we can overcome these challenges and make sure that we are thinking of solutions now that are really going to benefit local governments, benefit the citizens as we continue to serve them, but also not bleed them dry with taxes as well. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Excellent job. Very comprehensive coverage of the Bernori article. I hit all the major points. It is interesting how antiquated some of our tax systems are at the state and the local level. And as Jake pointed out, one of the antiquated aspects is just the inability of our tax systems to capture the mobility of people and capital in today's economy. And when you have this shift from manufacturing base to a service base, and now you have the shift to remote work and an online basis, it just makes it even more difficult to capture tax revenue, especially with traditional forms of taxation, such as the property tax. And so that really kind of puts local governments into a box, and then compound that problem with property tax limitations, like Proposition 13 here in California, and Proposition 2.5 in the state of Massachusetts. Those types of property tax levy limits make it even more difficult for local governments to really leverage their property tax to generate adequate amount of revenue. And so I think obviously the moral of the story is just like Jake said, is that we need to look at modernizing our tax systems and perhaps give some more consideration to service-based taxes and finding ways to tax this type of mobile citizenry and resources. We saw that with online taxation, and we had for years the ability of state governments to tax online purchases was governed by the court principles in the Quill versus North Dakota case from 1992, where in order to tax online purchases, states had to establish a physical presence nexus between the corporation and the state, that the corporation had to have some physical presence within the state. That physical presence nexus standard became more and more difficult to accomplish as you had businesses moving online, and as you had a shift away from maintaining inventories to producing goods on demand. And that's a huge difference. If you have to maintain inventories as a corporation, you're going to have some brick and mortar warehouses, some presence, some physical presence in the state. Once you start producing things on demand, especially if those goods are being produced overseas and then imported into the US, you don't have the same inventory to tax. You don't have the same physical buildings that you can tax with a property tax. Now, recently we had the Wayfair case, the Wayfair South Dakota case, that opened up the ability of state governments to tax online transactions, even without that physical presence nexus that we had been living with since the Quill versus North Dakota case. So that Wayfair case is probably opening up more taxing ability to states in terms of taxing remote sellers and online transactions. But we always have to try and modernize these tax systems. So the problem with modernizing a tax system is the political rhetoric that gets involved. And then whenever you touch a tax system, then you're going to be criticized as, well, you're raising taxes. So if you proposed a new tax system, a new way to levy taxation, well, you're proposing a new tax. And proposing a new tax is sometimes a death knell at the ballot box. And so sometimes it's difficult to really change those tax systems. So we really do need to update those tax systems to take account of all the mobility in both citizenry as well as resources and capital. Okay, thank you, Jake. Very well done. So that is the Bernori article. And then our final article for the evening, the economics of intergovernmental grants. I will leave that to Luis.
Sure, let me screen share. Did everybody see the screen?
Looks good.
Looks good. All right, let me go to slideshow here. Great. So good evening, everybody. We'll be talking about the economics of intergovernmental grants. This is, of course, from our course textbook, and it pulls from George F. Brake's, it's a segment from his Financing Government in the Federal System book in 1980. And of course, we pretty much already laid a foundation for a lot of what we'll talk about right now with the economics of intergovernmental grants with my colleagues' presentations, and really talking about how cooperative federalism is able to succeed, based on the ability of the federal government to act and allocate resources to the states and eventually the local governments to be able to achieve federal goals, and of course, in the process, help states and local governments achieve their goals. But in starting, George Brake pretty much outlines particular dimensions of intergovernmental grants, of which, of course, there are several. And really, a very big important factor. Well, there's three that he kind of outlines. The first being how the funds are going to be utilized by the grantee. And this is really kind of where we get into the specifics of the different types of intergovernmental grants available. One, of course, being the unrestricted general kind. And these are, pretty much boundless, a little bit more of the open kind, not so much narrow like a categorical type. So these are kind of open-ended in some ways, which is very similarly applies to general grants. They do have limited restrictions, but there is some element of administrative oversight there. Then we have block grants or broad program areas. Of course, what we're looking at like CDBG grants, community development block grants, which I'm sure a lot of you have either worked with or will eventually have the opportunity to work to either implement or write one. And then we have, of course, the categorical or functional, which have a very narrow program area. It means they're very specific to a purpose. They're very kind of like project grants, which we'll get into eventually, set to be, to fit a particular goal or produce a certain good, or very specific and tight to that narrow program area. So they're the complete contrast to the unrestricted or more general type of grant. So that's kind of really one of those elements that break outlines really how these funds are going to be utilized, and then how these funds are allocated. Of course, it goes back to the administrative oversight. Some grants that are available are pretty tight knit, going back to the categorical or functional. Currently, in my role, there's a lot of different grants that we benefit from in public safety, like one being the hazard tree removal. So we get funds from the state, from Cal OES, to eliminate hazard trees from throughout, residents in the city. Of course, being that we're in a very high fired zone, any little thing could set off a fire. And of course, if you have unsafe conditions in a property, that could, of course, exacerbate the issue. So we get funds from the state to be able to specifically address, the issue of removing hazardous trees throughout the city. And in the process, there's a lot of administrative checks. Our public safety director has to check in routinely with Cal OES, submit spreadsheets with kind of, specific addresses where these trees are being removed, the quantity of where these trees are being removed, and kind of, check back in with the vendor who's also properly disposing of these trees, of course, because we also have the ecological impacts of, tree removal, and then, of course, habitat removal and so forth. So it's very specific and very narrow in that way. And so, of course, some of these funds are unrestricted, but they also apply to that kind of statistical criteria or a formula that are set by the federal government. So these are the different types of funds, the different ways that funds are allocated to a grantee. And these, of course, it's intersectional with the first category that is outlined by break, which means, how are they going to be utilized? If it's unrestricted and pretty broad and loose in that way, they're going to be, allocated in a very unrestricted or very limited manner, still applying to a formula, but a little bit more loose compared to something like, more of an administrative, category C, what they say, like administrative checks or formula or a competitive application or project grant, where you're having agencies apply for a very particular kind of project, and you have to make sure that you're abiding by the guidelines set by that project and meeting that within a certain time frame, of course, to make sure that you're eligible, one, to receive the grants or continue to receive funding if that's the dynamic for that particular grant, and moving forward, right? And then you also have the level of participation by grantors, which is the third kind of category for understanding these intergovernmental grants. In some, you have no participation. It's just kind of, the funds are allocated to a grantee, and that's about as much as the grantor gets involved. You also have, administrative oversight, which of course ranges from very minimal, just kind of reporting on an occasional basis, to, strict kind of administrative oversight where you're routinely meeting with a representative of the grantor, submitting spreadsheets, submitting Google forms or whatever kind of form of reporting, is set by the grantor. You also have cooperative management where you're working hand in hand, with these different technical services. And then you have the two types of matching requirement grants, the closed-ended, where there's a limit of grantor funds, kind of, this happens a lot right now currently with our homeless initiative funding that we're receiving. Basically, the county through their homeless initiative is offering cities the opportunity to, put forth their own funding, and the county would match that funding to create some sort of new housing for, obviously homelessness. Instead of simply just, buying out units in different existing facilities, the county is willing to incentivize the creation of new homeless housing and matching those funds if a city is willing. Unfortunately, we do have the issue of NIMBYism that happens in the council of governments that I work in. So that's been a bit restrictive in the sense that obviously you don't have cities that want to abide by those guidelines, and therefore, those funds are sitting there just waiting to be utilized because no one really wants to, be able to put out their own money for homelessness solutions. And that leads to a different conversation, but it's kind of that, we'll go a little bit more into kind of the accessibility and restrictions of these types of grants, but you also have, when grantors are participating and you have, matching requirements that obviously require some involvement on behalf of the grantor, whether that be the state or the county who receives government funding from the state and obviously the federal government as well. And then you obviously have, the unlimited grantor funds too, where you're constantly giving, depending on if you're abiding by the program. You have what's called like the open-ended matching grants, where there's pretty much a boundless amount of resources, where you kind of don't really have a set amount. Whereas, with the closed-ended, if I put out 100,000, of course, the county's going to match that 100,000, and we're bound by that particular amount. Whereas the unlimited open-ended matching grants could exceed that amount, and so forth. So Break pretty much outlines this in a table and in this article as a means of understanding for primary types of intergovernmental grants that are pretty much widely used in today's day and age and have been used in the past decades. And by outlining pretty much these different dynamics is where he tries to kind of facilitate the understanding of these different grants. And one of these, of course, is the categorical grants, right? And, as noted prior, these require, compliance to strict guidelines. So they're a little less flexible. And in some ways, it's limited. It benefits grantors in the sense that you can, when you're giving these, you're making sure that you're granting these to somebody who is willing to abide by these guidelines, who applies knowing that, there is a requirement to abide by particular skill sets, right? If you have organizations who aren't capable or don't have the staffing or the experience to meet a specific guideline, then they're going to be deterred from applying. And therefore, these kind of help grantors solidify a solid applicant pool, right? And these are, a good example of these, the open-ended categorical grants is Medicaid, for example. And these are, of course, the purpose of these is for public assistance, for the public good. And they really help stimulate, state and local government expenditures in functional areas, right? You're making sure that your grantees are getting a lower price for benefits. There's an increased availability of funding because they are open-ended and they're providing a public good, like Medicaid, of course. You're pretty much stimulating state and local government expenditures in areas that local governments or state governments can deem to be functional. And they're allocated by formula. I mean, we talk a lot about formula grants, and these are, of course, guidelines like, specific disability or specific racial makeup of a particular community, or a very specific population where that is set by the federal government. That's kind of what how these categorical grants are allocated, right? The statistical criteria that is preset by the federal government. And they're basically, it allows for regular administrative overview, of course, because you have, you're not really, when you're allocating the grants by formula and the statistical criteria, you kind of open up a pool of potential applicants, and you don't really have applicants per se. You kind of, any organization that is providing the public good that fits within the statistical criteria is eligible for receiving these funds. And of course, with that comes the administrative oversight, comes with regular administrative overview of, how successful are these, grants being, are they actually amplifying service provision within that particular community? And they're pretty much awarded to state and local governments who want to then, of course, bleed those resources down to the local level and being able to have that oversight, right? Again, we mentioned Medicaid, for example, and pretty much they pretty much, they're not given solely to a local level, but administered from the state down, and of course have allowed the state or the grantor in general to have that regular oversight. But has anybody here had the chance of working with categorical grants before, or as in some ways had to have oversight of this? I'm sure if you're in a lot of county capability has a lot of, a lot of that. A lot of them thinking like if you work for the state, of course, you have a lot of that. But really there's, there's endless examples of different categorical grants that we can share. I think I see something in the chat box, but I'm not able to open it. But if you'd like, you could, say it out as well. I'm not able to open the chat, but yeah, basically this is one of the core type of grants that breakout lines. The second is a little bit more loose in that sense. These are what he notes as unconditional general grants, right? And these are unrestricted. It going again by that formula preset by the federal government. So there's really no competition as noted. If you're able to provide a public good for that population that is outlined by that formula, again, whether that be a specific, racial makeup or income level or, specific disability or whatever the public good that population would be intended for, you're bound to get it without much, if any, competition. And these are really, there's really no grantor participation as noted. The extent of grantor participation is really just the allocation of the funds, and they're really unrestricted. It makes up a very small percentage of actual state grant funding. And these are more of kind of general support grants that are pretty much allocated towards local governments to be able to pretty much amplify capacity, right? Support their initiatives, support their local purposes, whatever that may be, whether that be public safety, homelessness, that sort of deal. And it pretty much only makes up 10% of the state grant funding, but it does a great deal, of course, to local cities with not, who don't happen to count on a lot of, sales tax revenue or just tax revenue in general. I think it's a big support. And as noted, they're also allocated by a formula, and they're really intended to increase the income of recipient governments. As noted, not everybody has the resources that, that other major, more metropolitan cities have. And to be able to, continue to maintain a certain level of service provision, you want to make sure that you have those resources available. And that's really kind of where these general grants come in handy to be able to improve capacity and really just kind of keep supporting efforts or create initiatives for new efforts or the programs, whether that be. And they really have no effect on prices of goods or services. And even though, as noted, we have like 10% of state grant funding is actual general grants. There's no example of a completely unconditional general grant that is free from any sort of restriction or guideline. There's always in some ways, some sort of restriction. The one that, Break notes is it comes close, incredibly close to just kind of that completely unconditional general grant is what he notes as general revenue sharing. And these, of course, is pretty much general use as noted. Cities can have, these funds and use them to whatever they categorize as more important. Very limited restrictions, very minimal administrative oversight. There's really kind of just meant for cities or pretty much whoever the grantee is to utilize however they see fit for a particular purpose. So it's pretty broad in that sense. It's not as narrow as a categorical type of grant. But there's really a distinction there between those two. And then, of course, we have fixed amount grants, which, like categorical grants, are pretty narrow in scope, right? They're very specific. And even with that specificity, there's still what Brave would consider to be the most popular type of grant in the U.S. So they're very special purpose. They have a fixed sum, so go ahead and go very close-ended. There's a certain amount of money available for a specific type of project, and so it's bound by those kind of outlined guidelines, really, that of where folks can access to, and they're categorical as noted. They do have some limited restrictions. There is administrative oversight, and they are close-ended. So again, in some ways, it's intersectional to those kind of categorical. And some of examples like that are, of course, like Caltrans grants, to fix like something like Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu, or just really, any major interstate highway, CDBG grants, like, community developed block grants. And they pretty much, again, support the grantor, in this case, the federal government or the state, meet their expectations and their goals, right? While also supporting local grantee purposes. So you're able to kind of meet the needs and achieve that cooperative federalism that we're talking about, right? Where, the federal government would like to improve the conditions of an interstate highway, but they're able to do so through, state and local means. That's really where these come in handy. So they support both the grantor and the grantee in achieving their purposes without really overstepping, right? We want to, in the whole goal of, intergovernmental grants, as Break notes, is really to kind of not completely overstep or, aggressively overstep one's boundaries over another. It's really kind of to work hand in hand to be able to achieve this through, an expansion of resources. So basically local governments are acting in the interest of the state here. So it's very, it's probably why these are most popular type of grant in the US, right? You're kind of meeting the needs of both, and it really simplifies, budgetary and administrative dynamics of the grantor. So you're kind of not, your pressure is not so much on the grantor, in the sense that, kind of contrasted of the open-ended grants, where there's more of a pressure because, the grantee knows that there's an open-ended, capacity for funding. Whereas here you have a fixed amount, for example, that you have $100,000 to meet a specific goal. That's kind of what your guidelines and restrictions are. And that your grantee will not come and ask for more, because there is that guideline already set for a specific kind of, for a specific amount of money. So it does allow for the grantor to have control. It does allow for the grantor to have more administrative oversight, to where they're able to, monitor, monthly spending. If it's something like of a grant for a period of a year, you're able to monitor spending to ensure that the project is being met, but also that it doesn't exceed that, grant amount, or doesn't completely fall short of that grant amount. Of course, falls kind of relatively, adequate, so that you're still meeting the project goals there. So it's a bit of a unique in that way. So, obviously that's really why they're a popular type of grant for grantors, of course. And, it's one of, like, we had a discussion post not long ago, and I forget the actual name, but Kamara kind of outlined an organization, NACCED. The acronym is a public interest group that basically helps community organizations navigate the different intergovernmental type of grants like this, right? Because not every organization, of course, has the experience, maybe, or the staffing to be able to, seek out the grants, apply for them, and then have that be able to meet the administrative oversight requirements that some of these grants require, of course. And so, there is the good thing, we have something like NACCED or other, community stakeholders that are able to help organizations navigate some of these fixed amount of grants. Because again, there is money out there, as they say, and it really helps, again, improve and better capacity at the local level while still meeting the needs of the federal level. And I know I mentioned Caltrans, I mentioned different types of block grants. Has anybody here had the experience yet of applying for a CDBG, or is working on a CDBG and kind of helping carry out its purposes yet, or would like to learn more about CDBGs? Just because, again, it is, most cities utilize it. I mean, it's pretty, here in when I was working with the Mayor Garcetti administration, we use them a lot. Here in Malibu, we use them a lot to meet different needs. And again, it's a pretty common type of grant that is present pretty much in all cities, I would say, and it really helped, again, amplify that capacity and be able to meet project goals. And I am sorry, I know there's like 2 chats, I'm just can't seem to open it for whatever reason. Let's see. How do we get to?
You need to scroll up top to the green, and then you should be able to click chats from there.
There you go. Great, there you go. Perfect. Okay, there you go. Now I could answer these, of course. Kamara mentioned National Association for County and Community Economic Development. That's exactly the organization I was mentioning. So it's great to have organizations like that again that help navigate and expand capacity at the local level. Faisal brings up a great point. We do have a class on grant administration, and it's such a essential part of, I guess, if you're working in the public sector, to be able to understand how grants come to be, how we're doing this intergovernmental kind of level of grants, and how we're able to carry these out, and of course use them to the best of our abilities, right? Because that's really what, kind of going back to the corporate federalism aspect of it, we're really trying to be able to meet everybody's desired outcomes while making the best out of the resources available. And it's really kind of what has led to a lot of successes at the community level, being able to tap into a lot of these resources, which perhaps weren't available before. And as the realm of government continues to change and becomes ever evolving, I think a lot more opportunities are coming forward. I know when we had in LA, I know there was obviously a lot of advocacy being done regarding kind of law enforcement and kind of how the city's budget was being distributed. So that opened up a lot of doors for some money to be allocated towards some public safety initiatives, which thankfully a lot of our gang prevention and gang intervention agencies were able to tap into to increase the salaries of their staff, which of course are severely underpaid. And these are folks who are out late night, who are out in high crime communities, providing this essential service, and so they were able to tap into some of these resources to hire more staff, to focus on health and wellness, and really kind of improve capacity and really providing additional resources to their staff through these grants available to them. But it took something like NACCED or just pretty much professionals in the grant administration field to be able to expand the capacity. So this is a very important type of grant that is available at the local level, of course, and is able to expand capacity. And we kind of, in some ways, we turn to project grants here, which is the fourth and final type of grant that break outlines. And this one's a little bit more of a narrow, and again, more narrow, totally contrast to the unconditional general grants. So these are allocated towards a specific purpose. And these are like a federal Pell Grant is one ideal example of what a project grant is like. Again, bound by these guidelines and restrictions kind of outlined in these project applications. So these are more competitive. We're in the process now of doing home hardening here in Malibu, and there's grants for that, but these obviously require a very extensive application process with, examples, with outlines of kind of, whatever data is being required of that particular project. So they are very, very specific and narrow in that way. They do, again, help meet a particular need, whatever that need may be. In this case, it's home hardening for fire prevention, or again, federal Pell Grant to support, student education through their undergraduate career. And so folks, the grantees are bound by these guidelines, right? You have to make sure that you're staying in school, and you have to make sure that you're, doing these home hardening assessments throughout a particular period. So, but because of that, right, it is limited in a sense to only those who are capable and willing of performing the tasks required. So it does kind of shorten the applicant pool, which, again, it is great because, again, it does deter, I guess, inefficient or ineffective applicants or applicants who may not be able to provide the public good as best as one would desire as a grantor, and kind of limits it to only those who particularly have the capability of being able to excel in that way. So again, provides grantors with a stronger applicant pool, deters weak proposals, and really allows for a concentrated grantee selection. So, grantors are able to, field only the best applicants there and really kind of advocate for them when doing these grant reviews, and being able to allow for support and mainly maximizing public benefits. Because of course, this is public money. You want to make sure you're getting the best bang for your buck, and you want to make sure that you're getting applicants who can actually, meet these project goals and the guidelines set by them, and have the staffing and the capability of being able to follow through with that promise outlined in their application. So you want to make sure that you're outlining this kind of narrow project area to ensure that you as a grantor are, in this case, the federal government is meeting that public good and extending the love all the way down to the local level. And then pretty much, in doing so, a very unique, thing about project grants is really that grant design and the control of the grant itself is it facilitates transactions between two independent powers, right? You have like a student per se. These don't typically happen between the federal government and the state government, right? This is more or less, it avoids that superior versus subordinate relationship. It's a state giving, grants to someone who doesn't necessarily report to the state, right? It's independent of that kind of dynamic that exists between, a local government versus a state government, a superior versus subordinate relationship where there's a certain level of pressure, a certain dynamic that exists with having to meet the needs of your superior. Here is more or less you're just, when you have two independent powers, like a local nonprofit applying for a state grant to meet a particular project, it's a lot more unique in that they kind of operate without that sense of pressure, and they operate more freely to be able to achieve the goals now that they have the fiscal capacity to be able to carry out that particular goal. And so it's unique in that way, in that it doesn't necessarily happen between two particular relationships. But I know we outlined project grants, we outlined fixed amount grants, unconditional general grants, and categorical. So these are the various types of intergovernmental grants that exist, that are of course widely used by, in today's day and age and for the decades past. And of course, these could all be categorized by these different dimensions outlined by Break. But and just in wrapping up, I know if anybody has any questions, feel free to chime in. But I know a lot of us have either benefited from a grant at some point, or our organizations do, or we help carry one out. Does anybody here have any grant experience, whether that be grant writing experience, grant administrative oversight, where you have to, put together, some sort of reporting mechanism for a grantor so they make sure that your organization kind of continues to receive this grant? Or really just, Faisal, can you talk a little bit more about how you've been able to administer, a particular type of grant, or your organization in particular?
Yeah, I have administered several grants, I would say. One was from the state. It's called the State Safe Routes for School program. That is to make sure that ADA compliance and that traffic safety is enhanced around school vicinity of the schools. So it's very, very specific. So I was involved in one of those. And another one was that I got a grant for water conservation from the San Gabriel Association of Water. There's an organization that was so I was part of it. We built a garden that is like it's a water efficient garden, to show the people that try to use these native plants and things like that. So it's if you happen to be in Arcadia, it's on 2nd and Huntington Drive. That's the intersection that garden is. I was part of that. And then another major was about $500,000. We had a major windstorm event in the city, and the county, through the federal government, so the federal grant administered to the county provided us like about money to replace all the trees that was damaged. So, but those are very specific. They have a lot of restrictions. We have a lot of paperwork, because there are audits that we need to finally fulfill before, because the way the grant is given is we have to expend our local funds before, and then we have to get the reimbursement back. So during the time, if the money is not properly we don't properly keep track of the money, the work that happens, the county could come back and deny the grant even after we spending all the money.
No, those are ideal examples. I know the Safe Routes to School is a good one too. Were these close-ended, or in the sense that you kind of had a preset amount of money available to your organization, or were they more like just kind of a continuous open-ended process? I know Safe Routes to School was a little bit more fixed.
They had a certain amount of money, but they also had matching funds, which means that
Okay.
we had to come with like 50%.
Yeah.
And then there was a higher limit as well. So we had to choose certain areas, and then because the timeline, sometimes it's very difficult because it has to be a shovel-ready project because
Yeah.
these have a very tight window to close them.
Gotcha. No, that's perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I think those are 3 ideal examples right there of kind of the different dynamics, right, of intergovernmental kind of, and then Safe Routes to School. I think one of the unique characteristics too with that is if you're working with, like we had an issue in the previous city role that I had with LA, where one particular street that was to benefit from Safe Routes was shared between the county and the city of LA, because on one side it was city, the other side it was county. So the meetings that involved they involved a lot more people than needed to be there just because of that dynamic. And there was constant back and forth over the oversight of it and the implementation of it. So they can get complex, but that's just kind of really the unique dimensions of these intergovernmental grants. Well, thank you for that, Faisal. Does anybody else have any examples of having to work with grants before? Or
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of mention in terms of like the intergovernmental workings, we couldn't revise our municipal code to establish an anti-camping ordinance because of a Supreme Court case that basically said, hey, if you cannot provide some sort of reasonable accommodation to unhoused individuals, your ordinance you cannot have an anti-camping ordinance at the local level. So we had to turn around and look for funding at the county level, got the funding, and we were able to use, I think it was like a grant for about $1 million to create like a little tiny home village. And then once that was in place, then we were able to go back and amend our anti-camping ordinance to essentially be in line with the ruling of the Supreme Court. So it was just so interesting to really see the intergovernmental relationship happening all the way from the Supreme Court to the county level to the local level, and how that we had to like figure out and navigate through the different relationships to be able to just do something that typically is considered local control on behalf of a city. So
that's a perfect, and you're talking about Boise versus Idaho as the Supreme Court case.
yes, sir.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. Very interesting. So that's another perfect example, right, of having to jump through loopholes to meet particular guidelines, and some guidelines are set by, again, Supreme Court decisions, and then you have LA County who has to meet particular guidelines for their grant distribution and matching funds for the different homelessness solutions that they fund, which of course cities have to navigate, especially if they want to pass something, right, like an anti-camping ordinance, or for us it's like the overnight parking on PCH, or different kind of local policies that have to be navigated and meet a particular grant requirement. So thank you so much for sharing. That's a perfect example right there too, of kind of the fun dynamics of intergovernmental grants. Does anybody else have one more example before we close out the discussion, or are we good?
I can speak as someone, we are recipient organization of intergovernmental grants, so mostly county, LAHSA, and then usually that comes down from the state. Sometimes it's HUD funding, so the feds, and we're one of the little community organizations that have to navigate government speak. It's not for us or by us, so we have a lot of trouble navigating the grants, the restrictions, the reporting, the reimbursement models, the receipting. We've had to hire extra staff just to administer the grants and reimbursement process.
Gotcha. No, and you bring up a great point, the reimbursement process. I think that's another it could also be a deterrent for a lot of, again, small organizations that kind of operate on more of a reimbursement process where, even some of our homelessness services are operate in that way where the organization has to put out, I don't know, $35,000-$40,000 a month, which they may or may not have at times, and then we pay it back. And, you know, for a smaller organization who's barely getting their jump, you know, some of those kinds of grants are sometimes inaccessible. But, you know, you bring up a great point in terms of the allotment, right? It's kind of something to navigate, but it goes back to my point, right? It's great to have folks like, you know, NACCED and, you know, just people that are able to kind of help small organizations navigate through some of those hoops, because, you know, even though they do help amplify capacity at the local level, they are a little bit complex at times and convoluted and kind of restricted sometimes to organizations that have a little bit more of a solid foundation with, you know, adequate staffing and a little bit more resources, or existing resources rather. So thank you so much for sharing, Chris. And with that, we'll conclude the presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Luis. Yeah, I think the break article, primary utility of the break article is, as Luis took us through, it's kind of a, you know, taxonomy of all the different types of grants. And so it goes through, you know, project-based grants and formula-based grants. And, you know, the type of grant that is used by a grantor is going to be contingent upon what that grantor wants to accomplish. And so obviously if the grantor wants the grant recipient to accomplish the grantor's goals, then they're going to use something much more along the lines of, you know, a categorical, very specific type of grant as opposed to a more general block grant. Also, if there's a specific program or project, then a project-based grant will probably make more sense than a formula-based grant. However, if the goal of the grantor is equalization, then a formula-based grant will probably make a lot more sense. Now, there are problems associated with all these different types of grants. You know, in the discussion, many folks pointed out some of those problems in terms of the hoops that you have to jump through in terms of reporting requirements and the regulations associated with the grants. Project-based grants will allow governments to compete for the grants. And so ostensibly, the governments that will be competing for the grants are the governments that are interested in those types of projects or those types of programs. So that's a good thing about the project-based grants. The downside of a project-based grant is that sometimes they will foster grantsmanship, where you'll have governments that will hire grant writers just for the purpose of trying to write grants to get as much money as possible, even if those projects are not something that would be highly beneficial to the government, just so they can say, we generated X amount of money in grant proceeds. Formula-based grants, again, are good for equalization. The problem with formula-based grants is sometimes we don't engage in indexation. We don't go back and change those formulas and change the variables in those formulas to reflect current situations. And, you know, one good example of that is in terms of foundation formula funding for K through 12 education. And in a lot of states, you have these foundation formulas to give a base grant amount to each district within the state. Oftentimes, the formulas were calculated many, many years ago, sometimes decades ago, and they don't take into account the changing circumstances of different districts. And so a district that used to be a rural district in the 1970s and the 1980s, maybe a much more urban, much more metropolitan district with a much higher cost of doing business factor than it had back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And if you don't index, if you don't modify those formulas, then you're not going to be achieving that equalization that you want to achieve with formula-based types of grants. But again, we have seen this movement sometimes from categorical grants to block grants. We oftentimes see that in more conservative administrations. In more liberal administrations, we sometimes see the movement from block grants to categorical grants. The irony for a lot of subnational governments is that obviously they like the flexibility that they get from block grants as opposed to categorical grants, but oftentimes that flexibility comes with a price tag. And the price tag is, if we provide you with more flexibility in decision-making, we're going to take some of those grant proceeds away from you. So if you get the flexibility, you're going to lose some of that grant money. If you want more grant money, you're probably going to lose that flexibility. And that's kind of the double-edged sword that subnational governments deal with in terms of this tension between categorical and block grants. General revenue sharing, we saw that in the Nixon administration. to a much lesser degree in the Reagan administration, it was abolished. We really saw a movement toward block grants in the Reagan administration. And again, typically we see that whenever we have a decentralization, devolution type of orientation to our understanding of intergovernmental relations. The more decentralization, devolution are focused, more likely we're going to utilize block grants. The more centralizing our focus, the more decisions are made in Washington, D.C., more likely we are to use more specific grants such as categorical grants. And we'll have more to say about categorical and block grants next week when we get into some of the administrative aspects. We'll talk about some of the administrative implications, if you will, of going from a categorical to a block grant approach or vice versa. So this idea of categorical and block grants will live on for another day. We'll certainly discuss it again next week. Faisal, go ahead.
Professor, I wanted to share something about the airport improvement program. They have these grants, they call it grant assurances. And some of those grant assurances have really protected the protected airports from being taken over by the counties and state because they have, you know, they by federal law, they by law they have to the grantee has to give some assurance to the government, and apart from running the plan, the government's policies, it also protects the government from invasion from like the people who want to grab the lands to develop housing and stuff like that. So it was interesting that I read recently that there was in Denver, there was one county along with the developer wanted to acquire the airport land so that they wanted to build it. But then there was a clause in one of the grant assurances that this is not possible. They even took all the snowplows away. But then the federal government intervened to show them that on this, for the next 20 years, you cannot touch that. So I'm just sharing.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good example, Faisal, you know, those types of protections that you can build in because, and I think we see that, you know, as being beneficial in some ways. In some ways, it can also be limiting in terms of you have some of those grant assurances. And then if you'd like to do something like a sale leaseback type of bond, you're precluded from doing a sale leaseback because that's not allowed under the grant assurance that provide the funds for the initial construction of that facility. And so it can be very beneficial, as you're describing. It can also limit some of your more innovative financing mechanisms like Spraja told us about in the Spraja article. That's a really good example. Great. Any other observations or comments or anything on any of these fiscal federalism articles for this evening? Thank you to all our discussion leaders for doing a great job in pulling out all the important elements of each one of these articles. Faisal, go ahead.
One question regarding next week's class. Dr. Butts has invited us at 7 p.m. for a professional development event on Monday. So I want to ask whether it's possible for us to move the class to Wednesday, just next week only, if possible.
Thanks, Dr. Butts. Yeah, I got the email about that. It didn't even hit me that would be on Monday during our class sessions. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Do a lot of people have an interest in attending the professional development workshop? Few folks do. Okay. One is interested in as well. Okay, let's see what we can do. You know, we actually, I would be open to doing class on Wednesday, December 7th. Does anyone have a problem, a scheduling issue with shifting the class from Monday to Wednesday next week, shifting it from December 5th to December 7th? Is everyone good with that? Okay, if everyone's amenable with that, let's go ahead and do that. Yeah, we'll just, instead of having class on Monday, we'll have class then on Wednesday, starting at 6 o'clock. You know, afford you the opportunity to go to the workshop on Monday. That's absolutely fine with me. I looked at my schedule and don't think
Thank you,
I have
Professor.
anything on Wednesday. So yeah, we'll go ahead and do that. I'll send out an email reminder to everyone that we're going to be doing that. I'll change our link as well to make it a Wednesday instead of Monday for next week. And we'll have class on the 7th instead of the 5th. If anyone has any major issue with that, send me an email and let me know. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and make that change. So thanks, Faisal, for bringing that up. I had forgotten all about that. So great. Okay, perfect. Then next week on Wednesday, what we'll do is we'll talk about our administrative aspects articles. So we have the Moneypenny article. The Yuki, we'll start with that one to finish off our fiscal federalism. Then we have the 10th Commandments article with Coral. Kamala has the techniques of intergovernmental relations. Bernie has politics of unfunded mandates. And Christina has another look at bargaining article. So if you want to write an article critique on any of these articles for next week, please make sure to get those turned in by, we'll say next Wednesday now, since we won't have class until Wednesday. Get them turned in by Wednesday and for class. And I have noticed that there haven't been a whole lot of critiques coming in yet. That's pretty typical, and I understand that. A lot of folks like to backload to the end of the class, but just be mindful that you do have 2 of these critiques. And so if you haven't turned one in yet, you might want to seriously think about turning one in on those administrative articles for next week, just so you don't have 2 coming in at the very last class session. Ready? Okay, well, if there's nothing else, I think we're done for the night. So again, if anyone has any major issues with shifting the class next week to Wednesday, send me an email and let me know. Otherwise, I'll send out an email reminder, change the link, send the changed link to you, and we'll do class next week on the 7th instead of the 5th. Okay? All right, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great night, a great week, and I'll talk to you next Wednesday. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.